I'd like to welcome this morning Marty Alexander. And just to start out, if you could give us a sentence or two about your experience in your career that sort of led up to the point of having this chat today.
Oh, very good, Brian. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. My dad was in the U.S. Air Force and had 3 Canadian assignments, so I spent time in Ottawa, northern Quebec, and Vancouver Island. I went to school at university and graduated there in '74 with a degree in forestry, and then I did a master's following that period of time. So Brian Stocks at Sault Ste. Marie hired me, and back in 1976, and I spent nearly 35 years with the Canadian Forest Service, retiring in late.
Well, excellent. Thanks very much. And of course, the topics that we're working on today have to do with fuels and fuel structures. And so we have a number of questions that we kind of wanted to walk through a little bit to tap into your experience and your perspective on fuels. And we'll start off with the first question, which really is, in your experience, what are the most problematic aspects about how we've approached fuel measurement to date?
Well, I guess I should preface my response and just why do we sample fuels in context? Because our present Canadian Forest Fire Behavior Prediction System has relatively few fuels inputs. So the primary reason that, at least with respect to the Canadian Forest Service, that we measure fuels is simply to get a determination so that we can in turn calculate, it's one of the inputs into the fire line intensity equation, which would be in terms of characterizing the experimental fires or the wildfires that we've documented. So that's, I guess, an important point to keep in mind. I would say one of the most problematic aspects is, in my opinion anyway, is just an accurate determination of canopy or crown fuel consumption. In the early years of experimental burning, starting in about 1960, the Canadian Forest, in the subsequent years, used a variety of very simple ideas about canopy fuel consumption. One assumption was that just the foliage, needle foliage, was consumed, which that's pretty simple. I mean, if it's a crown fire, that's pretty simple. I mean, if it's a crown fire, yeah, the foliage is going to be consumed. But what is more difficult to assess is just how much woody debris in the crowns, live or dead or both, is consumed. So that's been approached by estimation later on. But it wasn't until we undertook the International Crown Fire Modeling Experiment Project back in 1995 that we undertook a more rigorous approach to canopy fuel consumption, where we did both not only pre-burn crown weight sampling but also post-burn. And to my knowledge, this is the only study like that done to date. And as it turns out, that's for good reason. As we found, it's an amazing, very labor intensive to do the post-burn crown weight sampling. So I thought measuring depth of burn of the forest floor layer was dirty, but crown weight sampling took on certainly a new level of dirtiness, if you will. So I just as a side story, I recall that when we were doing the study in the Northwest Territories, I indicated that after our first experimental fire, that the next day we'd have to do post-burn crown weight sampling. And some of the looks, all that friendly looking, because we'd never done that before, but the project required that we do a high degree of sampling with respect to canopy fuel consumption. So I guess the second thing I think is probably similar to the canopy is just the bark on the lower tree boles. In some fuel types, it's quite profuse or shaggy, and it's a difficult. It seems simple, but it's difficult. And the post burn, because you don't know how much bark consumption you're going to get until after the fact. So definitely those two would stand out in my mind.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I've seen the Eczema Site, and I can imagine what it would be like to be doing some sampling. But I do notice that it's growing back, so we're almost ready for another round up there, perhaps.
Well, I had I co-supervised a PhD student with Ellen McDonald at U of A, Natalie Lavoie, and she was looking at the time since last fire in terms of reburning potential. And so we did some of that. We were able to try to reburn some plots after 5 years. But I've seen people that have sent me pictures of the Eczema Site, and the last time I was there was in 2005. So I understand it's pretty dense.
Yeah, and NWT is looking at ways to sort of revitalize, probably a lot smaller scale, but some more burning to go on up there. So we'll see if they go.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Yeah, it'd be really neat. So anyways, so that kind of leads into the next question, I guess. What do you think are the most significant limitations or knowledge gaps when it really comes to measuring fuels that either haven't been totally addressed or that we really need to start thinking about?
Tough question. I suppose I'd have to say that if you look back at the history of fuel measurement and sampling in Canada, that we've definitely come a long way since 1960. Prior to that time, we didn't really focus in the Dominion Forest Service or the CFS on quantitative assessments of fuels. But when George Byram came out with his fireline intensity concept, in 1959, it required that fuel consumption input into the equation to calculate fireline intensity. And that's when the CFS had to start seriously taking into account both pre-burn and post-burn. The earlier work for the last 60 years has been summarized by Bob Keane in his 2014 book, Wildland Fuel Fundamentals and Application. And it's certainly the early pioneering fire researchers faced a lot of challenging problems, but it laid the foundation for what we currently appreciate. So I'd just like to acknowledge that people like Charlie Van Wagner at Petawawa, Victoria, and our own Dave Keel in Edmonton did a lot of the early work back starting in the early 60s that we've certainly taken advantage of their pioneering efforts. It's unfortunate that nobody's rolled up their sleeves and written a comprehensive summary of the fuels work undertaken to date in Canada, but that certainly needs to be done. I think I'd have to say that probably the one that stands out in my mind is that even though we can easily quantify fuel loads and bulk densities nowadays, and because of our efficiency in sampling methods, it doesn't mean that we can necessarily readily predict fire behavior or impacts. In other words, if we assume that fires can tell the difference by the manner in which we are sampling the fuel complex, I mean, that's a big assumption. We have for instance, surface fuels in terms of how we sample them, and we have a size class classification. But that's for convenience of sampling, and doesn't mean that we necessarily can base that knowledge on either theoretical or empirical fire behavior knowledge. As in terms of a significant knowledge gap or research need, I'd have to say for the next generation of fuels researchers in Canada that my question would be is how well can we expect the remote sensing technologies in the future will be able to capture what we've done by hard work on the ground in our fuel sampling in the years past. That would be the challenge I'd lay out to the next generation of folks.
Yeah, and that's certainly a significant and emerging one. We're all looking for the silver bullet, but it isn't always there. So, yeah.
Tendency of human nature to cut corners, and if we can get the satellites to do it, but and I know it holds great promise. It's got to be demonstrated.
So I guess related to that, so during your career, what was the thing to that? So during your career, what was the thing or the aspect or the most fascinating discovery that you learned about fuels during your career?
Some of my colleagues would say there was nothing fascinating. It's just simple hard work, but I do have one for sure, and it's in terms of the crown or canopy fuel sampling. I mean, it was well known in the literature starting in the 40s. There was a high degree of correlation between the various components of a tree crown, needle foliage, with small twigs and so forth, and the diameter at breast height or DBH of a tree. I mean, that was well established in the literature. And so different crown weight sampling projects, one in dead balsam fir, 3 in black spruce in Ontario, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories, one study in jack pine in the Northwest Territories. And when I was on educational leave from the CFS back in the early 90s, I did a study in slash pine in Queensland, Australia. And although this principle, as I said, was well established, this high degree of correlation, it was very gratifying to see that there was indeed a high R-square values, and so I was pleased over that. I guess as just a side note, I found it sitting out in the bush or the forest, clipping up tree crowns into its various components was actually quite therapeutic. And if you haven't done it, Brian, I'd suggest you give it a go. It's very therapeutic.
Maybe that's the beginning of some self-awareness work for us to tackle. So the flip side of that question is, what was the most puzzling or frustrating thing about fuels measurement that you've encountered?
Well, there would be many, but unquestionably, from my standpoint, would be we still have not really. In fact, nobody has really solved this problem. Is there's a stratum of fuels between the top part of the surface fuels, the ground surface fuels, and the beginning of the live tree crowns, what some people most commonly refer to as the ladder fuels or bridge fuels. And how best to sample those in a meaningful way still eludes us. And by that I mean I'm thinking of the entire global fire research community. I found from working in Australia, I was burning in some maritime pine, and found that maybe the best approach was a simple one, because we had no objective approach, but to look at the ladder fuels in terms of light, medium, and heavy. The ladder fuels in terms of light, medium, and heavy might be the best way. And it's interesting. Years later, I found that the Partners in Protection Fire Smart Manual, basically it took that approach of 3 categories, but still there's a universal model of to predict fire behavior, and specifically crown fire behavior in conifer forests, is going to have to tackle this issue of ladder fuels. I guess that I found was still a frustrating thing, and so I guess the other one that's worth mentioning is just the sheer laborious effort needed to sample the forest floor layers. Particularly, that's more straightforward, but it's still frustrating, just the physical labor required to get an adequate sample, and trying to sample the forest floor layer in a meaningful way. I guess we've kind of settled on trying to do 2 centimeter increment depths, and although it sounds great in theory, physically trying to do it in the field with knives and scissors and so forth is really definitely frustrating.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of that work is really just a brute force approach to try and tackle incredible complexity in a way that's manageable.
Well, it certainly is, and one of the best folks that I've ever seen to do the sampling of the organic layers, like the deep organic layers, was Brian Stocks. He's definitely got the touch for being able to slice off various layers of organic material. He's quite good at it.
Earlier on, but what sort of words of advice would you have for fire researchers and students who are studying fuels?
Well, don't get started. But I guess it probably goes without saying that it's essential to delve into the literature and including, and I would strongly emphasize including the older literature. Don't just assume because it's 1960 that it's not relevant. I really do believe you have to know where you're going, and so nobody's going to necessarily do this for you. You got to do your own homework, and it's good to be cognizant of the fact that the literature, the fuels literature, is not necessarily all archived on the internet. And one good search engine I might recommend would be simply called the Fire Research Institute. It's got, I don't know, nearly 200,000 PDFs online, and a good search engine. So that's a good starting point. But dig deep, check the references in the references, if you will. I guess the second thing I'd suggest is from my own personal experience that when I started my master's project in 1975, it was looking at the fuel structure in lodgepole pine stands on the Colorado Front Range, and as part of the agreement I had with the Forest Service that were funding the project, I had to prepare a study plan, and which included a literature review, and accordingly have that reviewed by a select group. And so I was fortunate to be able to get Jim Brown, who was definitely fuels pioneering researcher with the U.S. Forest Service, to review my study plan amongst other folks. So, yeah, take the time to write out what you're going to do, including a literature review, and have it reviewed. And anybody that's doing fuels research, if they haven't worked on a fuel sampling crew or team prior to starting a research program, so by a crew or team like Alberta has their or did have their wildland fuels inventory program crew, which I think what I did back in 1974 was did a summer of fuel sampling in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area in Idaho, and that prepared me quite well for starting my master program the next year. I had very few surprises, and I generally knew what to expect. Final suggestion is find a mentor or mentors to help guide you in your work. It may be on your immediate, if you're a graduate student, it may be on beyond your immediate committee. Maybe others. Even if you're an established researcher, still pays to seek out mentors. I think we all either formally or informally have mentors. I know that for me, Brian Stocks in the Sault Ste. Marie and Bruce Lawson in Victoria were long-term mentors. Semi-retirement, I still call and ask for advice. One thing is, I wasn't afraid to ask fuels researchers in the United States for advice, like Jim Brown and others.
That is excellent to bring that. And then I guess the question we'll close on is, what do you feel are the most significant career accomplishments so far when it comes to fuel measurements?
Well, I can easily think of two that stand out in my mind. The publication that stand out in my mind. The publication that we produced on characterizing the fuel structure in the Jack Pine Black Spruce Complex at the International Crown Fire Modeling Experiment territories really stands out. I think it was the report was published in 2004 as Information Report 393 by the Northern Forestry Center, and it's available online. CFS Pubs. I know the reviewers gave quite glowing remarks, and so I kind of believe, or at least I guess I believe that it's set a new standard for reports of the kind, and many others have followed suit. So that would definitely be, I guess, a career highlight for me. Because it went into great detail on crown surface ladder, and with a mind to getting the not only the pre-burn characterization, but also determining the fuel consumption by fuel strata. The second significant accomplishment would be, I think I'd have to say would be the collaborative work that Bill DeGroot and I did with Ross Wine and Ian Nalder at the University of Alberta back in the mid to late 90s dealing with the physical fuel properties of dead and down woody fuels in the prairie provinces and Northwest Territories. So basically, the area served by the Northern Forestry Center at the time. That work enabled both researchers and practitioners to more accurately calculate the fuel loads of dead and down woody surface fuels than had ever previously been done, and still used to this day. For instance, the project at Pelican Mountain in Alberta relies on that work in order to take their inventory data and in turn calculate surface fuel, woody surface fuel loads. So that the journal articles associated or summarizing that work are available on the CFS. I guess I'd have also an honorable mention in terms of accomplishments, and it would be with respect to the cooperative work I'd done with my colleague Miguel Cruz, who works for CSIRO in Australia. We developed the means to estimate canopy fuel characteristics in western forest cover types from tree and stand structure variables. So canopy fuel load could be estimated from tree height, mean tree height, and mean tree height, and stand basal area, for example. So we've turned that into software, the regression equations, program it for computer calculation, also produced tables from the regression equation. So actually quite proud of that work, and it's seen use in both research and in practical circles. So I guess those are out of my mind. There might be others that might have forgot, but I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Marty. I really appreciate you taking the time to share some of your thoughts with us. And it's, for me, a real privilege to be able to chat with you about this. So thank you very much.